It's September 1815. The Battle of Waterloo ended 3 months ago, but in London, nobody knows who won. Information travels at the speed of horses. Markets are frozen in panic. The entire British economy hangs on one question. Did Napoleon win or lose? Then a single man appears at the London Stock Exchange, Nathan Rothschild. He starts selling British government bonds. Massive amounts. Other traders watch in horror. Rothschild must know something. Napoleon must have won. Panic selling begins. The market crashes. Then, at the perfect moment, Rothschild starts buying everything at rock bottom prices. Hours later, official news arrives. Wellington defeated Napoleon. British bonds soar. In one day, Nathan Rothschild made the equivalent of £600 million in today's money. But here's what nobody talks about. He didn't just make a fortune. He bought control of the British economy. And this was just the beginning. The Rothschild family would go on to become the unofficial rulers of Europe. Not through armies or crowns, but through something far more powerful: debt. They discovered that the person who loans money to kings becomes more powerful than kings themselves. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history that reads stranger than fiction. 5 brothers from a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt built a financial empire that made them richer than most nations. They funded wars, they decided who won them, they created the modern banking system we still use today, and they did it all without ever holding political office. The story starts in 1744 with Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto. Jews couldn't own land, they couldn't join guilds, they couldn't even walk on certain streets. The only business truly open to them was money, lending, trading, exchanging currencies. Mayer started as a rare coin dealer, but he was playing a longer game. He cultivated relationships with nobility, especially Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of Europe's richest men. When Napoleon invaded, the prince fled, leaving Mayer with millions to manage. Instead of just hiding it, Mayer used it. He invested it, he multiplied it. But his masterstroke was his 5 sons. He sent them to the 5 major financial centers of Europe. Nathan to London, James to Paris, Karl to Naples, Salomon to Vienna, Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 network. This is where it gets interesting. In 1815, Europe was constantly at war. Governments needed money desperately. The Rothschilds had it. But more importantly, they had something nobody else did: a private communication network that moved faster than any government's. They used carrier pigeons, private couriers, coded messages. They knew about battles, revolutions, and market crashes before anyone else. In an age where information traveled at 5 miles per hour, the Rothschilds operated at 50. Think about what this means. Every government in Europe was making financial decisions based on week-old information. The Rothschilds were trading on what happened yesterday. It was like playing poker when you can see everyone's cards. The real innovation was government bonds. Britain needs £10 million to fight Napoleon. They can't raise taxes fast enough. So they issue bonds, basically IOUs with interest. The Rothschilds buy these bonds, but not with their own money. They sell the British bonds to investors in Vienna, Frankfurt, Paris. They take a commission on every transaction. Now here's the genius part. The Rothschilds aren't just middlemen. They're also the only ones who can move money across enemy lines. Britain and France are at war, but British bonds are being sold in Paris through the Rothschilds. They're funding both sides of the war. By 1818, the Rothschilds were handling government loans for Prussia, Austria, Russia, Brazil, Naples. They weren't just bankers. They were the entire international financial system. Let me put their wealth in perspective. In 1850, James de Rothschild in Paris was worth 600 million francs. The next richest man in France had 80 million. All other French banks combined had 350 million. One man had almost twice the capital of the entire French banking system. Nathan in London was even richer. His personal wealth exceeded that of the Bank of England's reserves. Think about that. One private citizen had more liquid capital than the central bank of the British Empire at its peak. But money was just the means. The real power was leverage. When Austria wanted to suppress revolution in Italy, they needed Rothschild loans. When Prussia wanted to build railways, they needed Rothschild capital. When Brazil wanted independence, they needed Rothschild recognition, because Rothschild recognition meant access to European capital markets. The family had an unwritten rule. They would only lend to governments if those governments maintained peace. War was bad for business. Well, most wars. The ones they couldn't prevent, they profited from. This created an absurd situation. Kings and emperors, who supposedly ruled by divine right, were taking orders from a family of Jewish bankers. Prince Metternich, the most powerful man in Austria, was writing almost daily letters to Salomon Rothschild. essentially asking permission for government policies. The family knew their position was precarious. They were Jews in deeply anti-Semitic societies. They were commoners with more power than aristocrats. They were international in an age of nationalism, so they developed strategies. First, they stayed absolutely loyal to each other. The 5 brothers and their descendants only married within the family for 3 generations. Of 21 marriages in the second generation, 15 were between first cousins. They kept the money and the secrets in the family. Second, they never sought political office. They stayed in the shadows. They turned down titles and honors when they could. When forced to accept them, they downplayed them. They understood that visible power creates enemies. Invisible power creates dependency. Third, they made themselves indispensable. They didn't just lend money, they provided intelligence, they moved diplomatic messages. They negotiated between hostile governments. They became the neutral ground where enemies could do business. Here's a perfect example. In 1832, Belgium wanted independence from the Netherlands. The Dutch wouldn't recognize it. The issue was debt. Who would pay the old bonds? The Rothschilds stepped in. They bought the debt, restructured it, and essentially purchased Belgium's independence. A private family resolved an international crisis that had Europe on the brink of war. But their most audacious move was in 1871. France had just lost the Franco-Prussian War. Germany demanded reparations of 5 billion francs, the largest sum ever demanded in history. France had 2 years to pay, or German troops would occupy the country indefinitely. The French government turned to the Rothschilds. In a series of bond issues, the Rothschilds raised the entire 5 billion francs from private investors across Europe. They paid Germany in full 2 years early. A private bank had essentially ransomed an entire nation. The commission on that single transaction was 250 million francs. $250 million for moving money from one place to another. By the 1870s, the Rothschilds were setting the price of gold itself. Every day at 11 a.m., Nathan's son Lionel would fix the gold price in London. Other banks would call in, and Lionel would literally decide what gold was worth that day. This continued until 2004. For over a century, the price of gold, the foundation of the global economy, was set in a Rothschild office. They controlled the Bank of England's gold reserves. They controlled the French money supply. They had a monopoly on mercury mining, which was essential for gold and silver extraction. They owned the largest railway network in France. They pioneered oil exploration in the Caspian. They funded Cecil Rhodes in Africa and the creation of Rhodesia. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Rothschilds weren't humanitarian heroes. They were monopolists who crushed competition. When other Jewish banks tried to enter government finance, the Rothschilds systematically destroyed them. They manipulated markets. They profited from inside information that would be illegal today. They also made some catastrophic mistakes. They backed the Confederacy in the American Civil War, betting that King Cotton would defeat the Union. They lost millions. They initially dismissed American expansion, missing the greatest economic boom in history. They were blindsided by the rise of joint stock banks that didn't need family capital. The real irony is that the family's greatest strength became its greatest weakness: secrecy. As public companies required transparency, the Rothschilds' obsession with privacy made them seem sinister. Every economic crisis got blamed on them. Every war was supposedly their plot. The anti-Semitic propaganda was vicious and relentless. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that infamous forgery, was largely inspired by conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds. Hitler's propaganda machine made them the symbol of Jewish financial domination. The Paris Bank was seized by the Nazis. The Vienna Bank was Aryanized. Family members fled or died in the Holocaust. After World War II, the empire was broken. The Naples and Frankfurt banks never reopened. The Vienna Bank was gone. Only London and Paris survived, shadows of their former selves. Nationalization of industries they invested in, railways, mining, oil, destroyed much of their wealth. By the 1980s, the London Bank had just £50 million in capital. One mid-sized hedge fund today has more. But here's what's fascinating. The system they created didn't die. It evolved. Today's investment banks do exactly what the Rothschilds pioneered. They intermediate between governments and markets. They trade on information advantages. They profit from every transaction, regardless of outcome. The difference is that it's no longer 5 brothers in 5 cities. It's thousands of traders and hundreds of firms, connected by fiber optic cables instead of carrier pigeons. The profits that once went to one family are now distributed among shareholders. But the mechanism is identical. Modern central banks issue bonds. Investment banks buy and distribute them. Governments depend on these banks to fund deficits. Banks depend on governments for bailouts when bets go wrong. The too big to fail banks of 2008 were playing the same game Nathan Rothschild invented in 1815. Look at government debt today. The US owes $33 trillion. The UK owes £2.7 trillion. These aren't numbers that will ever be paid back. They're numbers that will be rolled over, refinanced, and managed by financial institutions that profit from every transaction. The Rothschild model didn't disappear. It became the entire system. The family still exists. The current Lord Rothschild is worth about $2 billion. Respectable. But Jeff Bezos makes that in a week. The Paris and London banks merged and were eventually sold to other firms. The family focuses on wine, art, and charity now. They're wealthy, but not powerful. They're famous, but not feared. Yet their ghost haunts every financial crisis. Every time markets crash, someone blames shadowy bankers. Every time governments print money, someone invokes their name. They've become mythology, a story we tell ourselves about how power really works. But here's the uncomfortable question. The Rothschilds proved that in a capitalist system, the lenders control the borrowers, the creditors control the debtors, and governments are always borrowers, always debtors. Which means democratic governments aren't controlled by voters. They're controlled by whoever owns their bonds. Today, that's pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and yes, investment banks. Dispersed ownership instead of family control. But the power dynamic remains identical. The Rothschilds didn't invent this system, they just perfected it. They showed that you don't need an army to control nations. You don't need a crown to rule. You just need to be the one everyone owes money to. And in a world where every government runs on deficit spending, where global debt exceeds $300 trillion, where central banks print money to buy their own bonds, we're all living in the house that Rothschild built. The question isn't whether the system is good or bad. The question is whether there's any alternative. Because every attempt to escape it, communism, fascism, cryptocurrency, either fails or gets absorbed back into the debt machine. The Rothschilds didn't just control Europe for a century. They created a model of control that outlived them. And that's the real legacy of the family that ruled without ruling. They proved that, in the modern world, power isn't about territory or titles. It's about who owns the debt. And someone always owns the debt. The five brothers are long dead. Their banks are mostly gone. Their fortune is dispersed. But every time a government issues a bond, every time a central bank sets interest rates, every time debt determines policy, the ghost of Nathan Rothschild is there, counting his coins. The family that controlled Europe without ever ruling a country didn't just make history. They made the system we're still trapped in. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. We talk about democracy, sovereignty, independence, but in the end, every nation answers to its creditors. The Rothschilds just figured it out first.